All right, good afternoon, Valencia students, and welcome to our lecture number 9 on the construction of the Hellenistic world. If you've never heard the term Hellenistic before, its origins come from the Greek word Hellesian, which means to identify with Greek culture, traditions, or language. What we're going to see is a time in the ancient world when Greek becomes the dominant paradigm for the peoples of the ancient world, and that this is facilitated by a young man from a region called Macedonia, a young man by the name of Alexander, who will go down in history as Alexander the Great. But as we'll try to explore, perhaps the term great isn't such a great term for this young man, and we'll let you decide in your lecture feedback. Now, who are the Macedonian people, and how are they related to the other Greek-speaking peoples? What we'll see is the Macedonians are essentially the Greek-speaking peoples to the very northern parts of the Greek peninsula, who had very different traditions and cultures than the other Greek-speaking peoples to the south of them, people such as the Athenians, the Spartans. We first see settlements of people in this region at the north of the Greek peninsula around the year 800 BC, during the very beginning of the Archaic Age of the other Greek city-states. Now, what's challenging when it comes down to understanding something about the Macedonians is that as while other Greek regions were developing what we called a city-state polis region, where you would have a government in charge of Athens, a government in charge of Sparta, is that the peoples of the north came under a unified leadership and called themselves the Kingdom of Macedon. Now, to understand how the other Greek people thought of the Macedonians, is they thought of them as sort of their backward cousins in the north. If you think sometimes of some of the stereotypes that Americans have of the difference between people who live in the north who are proper in culture and them hillbillies that live in southern areas in the Appalachians, they may all speak the same language, but there's a conceptualization that somehow the people in the American South are somehow lesser in terms of civilization, and the Greeks do this in the exact opposite way, as they think of the people in the northernmost parts, the Macedonians, as essentially their backwards hillbilly cousins, because they don't have city-states, they have kingdoms. What's going to bring about a transformation of the role of the Macedonians will be the leadership of King Philip II. Now, after almost 50 years of the Greek peoples at constant war with the Persians, and then at constant war with each other through the Peloponnesian Wars, the Macedonians to the north started seeing opportunity that Greek peoples were getting resentful of the leadership of Athens, as well as the leadership of Sparta, and they were looking for some fellow people to rally them together and to give a common identity. And that will be the role of the Macedonians. King Philip II is going to completely restructure his kingdom based upon complete military lines. He is going to say the Macedonian people are the front lines protecting Greek culture and civilization against the evil oppression of the Persians. And he is going to succeed in the year 338 BCE to put together a military alliance called the League of Corinth. The League of Corinth will serve as essentially an outpost for Macedonian rule over other Greek-speaking peoples to rally people together to go to war against the Persians. While it is Philip II who puts these things together, it will be his son Alexander who will carry on the traditions. When Alexander was a very young man, born in the year 356 BC, his father envisioned that Alexander, if he wanted to be taken seriously by the other Greek peoples, that he needed to be an excellent balance of the Greek traditions of the training of the body as well as the training of the mind. So at a very young age, Alexander was allowed to tame an incredibly wild horse that was brought in, a black steed that went down in history by the name of Bucephalus. When others could not tame this horse, young Alexander came in and he trained and he broke this horse and he rode this horse on until the day it died, conquering battle over battle. He became famous very early on. But to train his mind, at the age of 13, Alexander's father brought in Aristotle to be Alexander's personal tutor. And here is where I've got some questions about the greatness of Alexander, is that when one is given the opportunity to study one-on-one with perhaps one of the smartest people on all of planet Earth, and one decides to take that potential and training of a great mind and to squander it upon military campaigns, We'll ask ourselves some questions. Could Alexander have been greater if he would have stuck with more of the traditions Aristotle was trying to bring forward to him? What the Macedonians are going to become known for, and why other Greek peoples are willing to defer to their leadership, is Philip II helped to bring about a new military technique referred to as the phalanx. What the phalanx was considered in the ancient world a completely invincible force. What you do is you would have rows where you have 16 soldiers in a row, and those soldiers would go 16 soldiers back, essentially a 16 by 16 square. And each of these soldiers would be armed with a shield as well as an 18-foot pike. And with each row as they went back, the pikes would go up higher and higher at different angles, which means as one was coming forward, as the phalanx was marching towards you, you were about to be impaled on a bunch of spikes. If you attempt to resist against them, let's say you are on a horseback cavalry unit, if you can actually get past those first spikes, guess what? If you jump up in the air, your horse is going to get impaled on the second or third row. Along with this, what Philip is able to design is what he calls the hammer and anvil strategy, with utilizing the phalanx. What he will do is he will have his phalanx units coming forward, driving the enemy backwards, because when enemies see this formation coming towards them, you start to retreat because you don't know what to do. As enemies are in this sort of panic of systematically retreating as the phalanx is coming towards them, is that Philip then would have horseback cavalry ride in behind the enemy and push the enemy forward into the phalanx unit, giving the enemy only two choices: death or surrender. For almost 2 decades, the phalanx strategy is going to be thought of as completely invincible in the ancient world. So when Greeks are looking for somebody who is willing to come together and give them a strategy to protect them from the potential oppression of the Persians, is they're going to defer to Macedonian leadership with the phalanx strategy to go forth and to attack against the Persians. Now, in the campaigns of Alexander the Great, we're going to start to see more and more of a manifestation of peoples of a European descent starting to differentiate more and more in their head a difference between a European West and an Asiatic East, and asking the question, is the true source of power in the ancient world, is it trying to conquer and to take the areas of the Middle East controlled by the Persians, or to focus on something else, to focus on trying to gobble up the Mediterranean? Alexander will attempt the strategy of simply conquering and taking over the Persian Empire. He will succeed at this, and there'll be several hundred years of Greek dominance of the ancient world. But we'll see by the end of this week, as the Romans start to rise up, the Romans will take a completely different approach, not wanting to get themselves directly involved in the centralized affairs of what we call the modern Middle East. But essentially, Alexander, as we'll see here in the pointer, Alexander starts off with just this little empire of Macedonia, blah, 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 little kingdom, and comes out and bam, bam, he's going to come through here, he's going to come down through here, and he becomes a friggin' pharaoh, then he comes through here, and he kills off Darius, and he takes the throne, and then he's going to take his soldiers way over here, and his soldiers are going to get over here, and they're going to go, what the hell? Boss, unless we go home now, we're going to kill you, boss. And Alexander goes, pansies, fine, whatever, let's go home. But not all the way home. Let's call our new home and our new ruling place Babylon. I'm sure that's going to go swell, Alexander. Not so great. So, what is it that is going to trigger another couple decades of wars between the Greek peoples and between the Persian peoples? It's going to be a series of 2 different assassinations, both of which happen in the year 336 BCE, and 2 major leaders calling for vengeance. What is going to happen when Alexander is just 20 years old? His father, King Philip II, is having a big wedding feast. Alexander's sister is getting married. There's people everywhere. And in the middle of the wedding feast, stab. Philip II stabbed to death at his daughter's wedding feast by one of his bodyguards. But the bodyguard was a person who had a grudge because he had some origins and connections with Sparta and didn't want Macedonians being in charge. But Alexander sees a prime opportunity. He says, this was not the work of the Spartans, this was the work of the Persians. The Persians must be behind it. Let's blame a foreign power and go to war, when the foreign power had nothing to do with the death of Philip. At the same time, King Arses of the Persians is killed. And who are the Persians going to blame it on? They're going to blame it on the Greeks. Say the Greeks were behind this assassination. All of a sudden, a 20-year-old named Alexander and a 40-year-old named Darius III are both going to be in charge of major empires and are both going to call for war. What is going to trigger this was something the Persians never fully expected. Prior to this, any wars that had gone on between the Persians and the Greeks had primarily been Persians crossing over into the Greek mainland, having some naval battles, some invasions, things like that. They never thought the Greeks would be crazy enough to launch an invasion of what we now call the Anatolia Peninsula, also known as Turkey. The year 335 BCE, Alexander is going to cross over what is called the Hellespont, and he is going to bring with him 35,000 soldiers, a number of them cavalry units, but most of them in the phalanx. Initially, there will be a wave of 40,000 Persian soldiers coming out to battle them, and they're going to get utterly destroyed, and then they're going to send in 80,000 more troops, and this time Darius is going to lead the troops himself, and in the middle of this battle, his entire family is captured, and he tries to negotiate for the release. Alexander, can I please just have my family back? And maybe we can be cool. We'll say you, like, control some of these spots. That would be alright. And Alexander, despite all of his major advisors saying, you should really negotiate with Darius. We just, like, more than doubled our land, and, like, we can consolidate this and all these things. And Alexander, he's got a problem. The first major book that Aristotle ever gave him was Homer's Iliad. And the main character of Iliad is Achilles. And Achilles is full of anger, rage, and Achilles is invincible. Not a very good hero for Alexander to emulate if it is about consolidating empire. What we're going to see is Alexander is going to start putting forward the age of 21, the idea that he is the embodiment of Achilles, and that he, like Achilles, is a demigod and invincible. And he says to Darius, not only will I not negotiate with you and give you your family back, I'm going to conquer all of your territory, and at some point I will personally track you down, and I will murder you with my very bare hands. So, Alexander, that sounds great, I think. So, in order to strategically consolidate his position before driving into the heart of the Persian Empire, to attempt to personally murder Darius himself, is that Alexander's first strategy was to take over the entirety of the Mediterranean regions that had been dominated by the Persians. That way the Greeks could take over all of the different ports, the Greek navy could dominate over the Mediterranean, and then after consolidating those territories, they're absolutely strategic to then march his troops into the heart of the Persian Empire and going after cities like Babylon. But if you are going to round about, going around the Mediterranean on the coast, the first peoples who you run into are the ancient Hebrew peoples, also known as the Jews. We will talk about them in our next lecture. The greatest challenge for the Hebrew people anywhere that they attempt to settle is that when outsiders come in and they conquer, if you're the Hebrew people, should you resist against them and try to flex your idea that you should be your own kingdom because God has promised you territory? Or do you surrender and assimilate and try to bide your time to hope that whoever has just conquered you does not, I don't know, attempt to murder all of you? Because that is much of what it means to be Jewish throughout human history, is people attempting constantly to try to murder off all of your people. So, during this time, the holy city of Jerusalem is ruled over by a great rabbi known as Simeon the Just. When Simeon hears that Alexander and his forces are coming towards the holy city of Jerusalem, Simeon has a strategy, a great technique from rabbis called storytelling. The grander the story, the more wonderful it is, and the more people might buy into it. So, having heard many stories about the potential brutality of Alexander's forces, Simeon doesn't just wait for Alexander to show up. Simeon marches outside of Jerusalem to await Alexander. And when Alexander comes, Alexander, he had been given some advice on this from Aristotle, saying if you ever interact with the Hebrew people, if they think of themselves as unique, you should treat them in a unique way. So Alexander, instead of going on the attack, Alexander got off from his horse, and he bowed down to Simeon the Just. And Simeon said, I have come to welcome you in the name of our one true God, Jehovah. And Alexander says, well, actually, I had a dream recently that an angel came to me, speaking that the angel was a representative of your one true God. And Simeon says, yes, of course. I was just coming out to tell you that, oy vey, of course, it was an angel. And I had the same dream. And I believe that since we are God's chosen people, and this angel has come to you and also come to me, and I'm not just making this up as I go, that you are the anointed holy warrior of the one true God, Jehovah. And Jehovah, as we'll see next time, has all sorts of special powers, can smite down all the firstborn sons of Egypt, which is a great God to have on your side if your next stop is Egypt. So what Simeon does is he gives Alexander a tour around the holy city of Jerusalem and says, in tribute to you as our great new ruler, who you have the power of Jehovah, as for the next generation, every young man who is born here, we will name Alexander in tribute to you. And we will adopt your Greek ways, we will adopt Greek language, heck, we'll even write our stories down in Greek. And we'll make sure as we tell the stories of our God, who's really good at smiting people and kicking people's asses, we'll write them down in Greek. And that way you will know about the power and not to mess with us. We'll see this unfold more and more this next week. But also, Simeon says, and as you're on your way to Egypt, tell the Egyptians, the Jews say hello. So as Alexander's forces started coming closer to Egypt, stories had gone around about the potential brutality of Alexander's forces. In one of the Palestinian cities he came to just before reaching Egyptian territory, stories circulated that he had slaughtered the entire city. They had taken all the women and children and sold them off into slavery. So when he reached Egypt, everyone just surrenders. They say, hey, welcome. We haven't had a pharaoh in a while. How would you like to be pharaoh? Anointed by the gods? And Alexander, he's just racking up deities left and right. He said, I just came over here from our Greek gods, but now I've got Jehovah on my side. Heck, I'm a pharaoh. And he says, I will accept this, and I will be your new pharaoh. And I will focus in with Greek wealth that I'm going to get from pillaging places all over to expansion of the power of this territory of Egypt here, and the Mediterranean will be the source of all of the powers. And he said, in fact, when I'm all done with my conquering, I will start up a new capital city here as your pharaoh, and the city will be called Alexandria. And that will be one of the greatest legacies of Alexander the Great, is the great city of Alexandria. And Alexander will now be taking on the title of the King of Kings, because he's got the Greek gods on his side, he's got the Hebrew gods on his side, so Simeon says. And he's a pharaoh. What better time to maybe go attack the Persians? So, once Alexander had taken these important regions in the Mediterranean, Darius thinks, Alexander trained under smart people like Aristotle, I'm sure he's a reasonable man. Why don't I just put out some more offers to him that we can live in cohabitation and peace, that there doesn't need to be a conflict between our two civilizations, that I will recognize you as the Egyptian pharaoh. I will recognize you as the king of kings of the western territories. Heck, your dad's dead. I'll even be your father-in-law. How about that, Daddy Darius? You can have my daughter. She'll be a present. She can be your bride. And Alexander's reaction is he says, no. Not only do I not accept any negotiation with you, but I'm still going to kill you personally. And after that, heck, I might even still just marry your daughter. Just because I'm Alexander. and I can. So, Darius attempts to lead a few battles. It goes poorly. He tries to negotiate again, and his advisors are going, Darius, what it means to be a Persian king, king of kings. We don't negotiate with these slave trading Greeks. We crush them. And you keep trying to negotiate, and you keep retreating, and you are a sheer embarrassment to the Persian Empire. So in 330 BC, after retreating from areas of what we now call Baghdad, or at that time known as Babylon, after retreating off into areas of the northeast, Darius is killed by a number of advisors. And when Alexander finally finds Darius's body, oh, he was furious because he wanted to kill him himself. There are a number of different stories as to what things were like when he found Darius. Some people say that he found his body simply lying in a wheelbarrow-style thing at the city gates. Others say that he tried to track down his body, but at the end of the day, what he is going to do, even though he's put up these years of, I'm going to kill you, is he marries his daughter, and then he takes Darius's body, and he takes it back to Babylon. And he gives it a grand royal funeral. And he says, I have inherited the throne of the King of Kings, and I rule over you in a similar style as the Persians. And I will expand out territory to make this an even grander empire. This was not something anyone expected from Alexander. So, in the year 326 BCE, Alexander leads his troops to march further to the east, because it wasn't just enough to take Babylon, as he was going to march through the territory of traditional Persia and try to get all the way over to a very mysterious, mystical land, which we would study at this world history, called India. Now, here's the problem of trying to conquer India. One of the most sacred symbols in India, when it comes down to their religion and their culture, is the elephant. The elephant is associated with the Hindu god Ganesh, the god of knowledge and wisdom, but it is also known as the protector. Because here is the problem. When Alexander sends his troops forward, I mean, they've got to march through all the mountains of Persia. They get through all these mountains. They get through the desert. They start going to this territory called India. And all of a sudden, when they're out there in their phalanx positions, all of a sudden, thousands of elephants come storming at them. And Alexander's troops go, oh, what the hell? Because the elephants can get past, like, we don't figure out as modern civilization how to stop an elephant until we come out with really, really big guns. Because elephant hide, yeah, it's very tough. And elephants, yeah, they can take a stabbing and a stabbing and a stabbing and keep on a trampoline. So, finally, Alexander's soldiers, after 11 years of following this man and marching 11,000 miles and conquering the entirety of the Persian Empire, they say, can we just go home? And when Alexander's like, let's keep going forward, they say, if we don't get to go home now, we may kill you. No general wants to be killed by his soldiers. Generals also want their soldiers to be happy and to feel well paid. So he says, fine, we will return back to my temporary capital of Babylon. From there, we will consolidate my empire, and we will figure out where we'll move forward next. So, to try to claim a long-lasting legacy, once Alexander and his troops returned to Babylon, his story had already been getting documented by historians who had traveled with him and talked with himself and troops as he went through with his battles. But while reigning from his new capital city of Babylon, is that more and more Alexander tried to put forward the story that he was actually the son of the god Zeus. He claimed that his mother Olympia had told him that she was a virgin when Alexander was born, that he was a divine miracle, a virgin birth, and that he was the son of God, and that he was to go forward and to reshape the entirety of the world. To try to appease his soldiers who had marched with him for 11,000 miles, as he paid them plenty in terms of looting, because soldiers do this all the time, and he encouraged all of them to settle down, to marry Persian brides, to begin building families, to now take over the elements of the Persian Empire, and then to prepare to go forward, because he said, next summer, we're going to conquer the Arabian Peninsula. And his soldiers' reaction to that was like, what? Why would we do that? Because all that existed in the Arabian Peninsula at that time were Arab people who at this time were essentially, they're just sort of, one could say, looters and pillagers of the ancient world. Is that they hadn't really built up any civilizations in the Arab Peninsula. It was essentially just a desert wasteland with a few cities here and there, some trade going on, but what the Arabs were notorious for were for looting from merchants traveling through. And they're like, why would we want to travel through there and go through desert wasteland to conquer nothing? Because there were no major cities there at that time. So, according to different stories, Alexander in the year 323 BC, after making this grand announcement to his soldiers, is that he was having a huge feast, and Alexander was known for binge drinking. A number of his generals died at different times because Alexander would get stupid drunk, they'd disagree with him, and he'd murder his generals, just to try and make a point that, well, it's one thing to have your own personal views, but I'm Alexander, I'm the son of God. Miracle virgin birth, don't disagree with me. I'm here to lead a whole new world order. So, Alexander led a feast, and he got horribly sick. And for 14 days, apparently, he had a huge fever. When people asked, "Sir, if you die, who will inherit your empire?" As the only phrase he would say is he'd say, "My empire will go to the strongest." Essentially, setting things up that he conquered the Persian Empire. He gets sick, and he says, "And time for a war. Let's see who's the strongest." Luckily, after Alexander died, it did not turn into a period of civil wars. Is that the major generals of his armies took what Alexander had conquered, split it up into 3 major kingdoms, and said, each of us will reign over a different part of the kingdom, and will allow free trade and free movement of peoples to go back and forth. We will all speak the Greek language. We'll have elements of a common currency. Well, essentially, we'll open up the borders of the Middle East to try to build upon this amazing empire that has been constructed. So, in the areas of Macedonia and Greece, Antigonus became the king of Macedonia. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the next Pharaoh of Egypt, was once again another Greek, one of Alexander's best friends from childhood, Ptolemy. Ptolemy is also known as a sort of amateur astronomer. That'll be important in our next slide. And Seleucus will become the king of Persia. And during this time, we'll see the Hellenistic era for a period of almost 300 years as these territories of Europe, of Northern Africa, and of the Middle East interlinked together into a common structure where people had an international language of Greek. They adopted elements of Greek values. They adopted elements of Greek dress. And they blended different elements of the ancient world, all starting to learn from each other. So the greatest legacy of the Hellenistic era, which will take on the name of Alexander, and part of the reason why he has still been known as Alexander the Great, has to do with the city that was built in tribute to him, Alexandria. Alexandria became a new phenomenal port city right there on the Nile at the opening close to the Mediterranean Sea, and was known as one of the great wonders of the ancient world. The city itself, there was a beautiful lighthouse in the middle of the port, which helped boats to come in safely. Huge open harbor so boats could have an easy way of parking. And the hills overlooking the port itself, beautiful villas and mansions built within the hills. And there within the city, the construction of the Library of Alexandria attached to the Museum of Alexandria. At the Museum of Alexandria, they had different collections of things from throughout the world. They actually had what one could call a cafeteria for families to come there, because along within the museum, they actually had a petting zoo for children to interact with animals from all over. And the library itself, particularly when Pharaoh Ptolemy II stated that he wanted the expansion of the Library of Alexandria, as he said, "I want a copy of every single book that has been ever written by any civilization brought together in one spot so that learned people can come together. These books can be translated into Greek, we can preserve them, and we can build upon the knowledge of the ancient world to bring about a concept of human civilization and progress." And that library will be one of the most amazing spots on planet Earth until Julius Caesar burns it to the ground, because he is a jackass. That is the proper social scientific term for him. Julius Caesar, if you burn Alexandria, you're a jackass. Along with this, there is also a star observatory. There at the observatory is the notion of geocentrism is going to be challenged by Greek scientists. Greek scientists, when they are charting out the stars, when they're looking at how things move around, is they come up with the notion of what they call heliocentrism. As they say, the sun is the center of all things, and the earth, like anything else around us, is revolving around elements of the sun. The problem with the heliocentric model, as well, they've got a lot of data to help support this and quantify it, is that the Pharaoh Ptolemy also considers himself a bit of a junior astronomer. As he said, geocentrism, well, that just makes sense. You should go with that. But within the scientific community over the next couple thousand years, people know very well that everything doesn't revolve around the Earth, that the numbers don't add up, and they're simply waiting for others later on, Galileo and Copernicus, to be able to quantify this, to instead of having a theory, to be able to prove such things. Along with this, amazing chief librarians such as Eratosthenes are going to use things like geometry to try to figure out what the circumference is of planet Earth. Because unlike the tales of Columbus, which were written in fiction, nobody thought that the Earth was flat. Everyone knew it was round ever since the Greeks, because not only the Greeks know the Earth was round, but they actually measured the circumference of the Earth by simply using geometry and looking at elements of shadows. And Eratosthenes, he was only off by, I think his distance, he was off by like 700 kilometers. Like the actual circumference of the Earth is something like 40,000 kilometers. And he had measured it like 300 kilometers or something like that. But yeah, they knew it was round. They knew how big around it was. They knew areas such as Asia. They had people who said, hey, maybe if we sail this way, we could make it all the way around to Asia since the Earth is round. They understand very advanced things. They're going to refine the number pi. They're going to use the number pi to help to expand out upon aspects of geometry, utilizing Pythagorean theorem. And once you figure out all these different things about angles, about circles and different things, is you can advance elements of engineering, because you need math. If you're going to build structures that are not going to fall down, you need the mathematicians to engineer these things. And the city of Alexandria will be the heart and the epicenter of Hellenistic culture, where the traditions of the past ancient world are going to interact. They're going to blend different ideas together, back and forth, and there will be a certain amount of internationalism that exists within the ancient world for several hundred years. That internationalism will be dominated and defined by a European power who was in charge of both Southern Europe, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. And during this time, for the fact that people are speaking Greek, is they'll utilize that to try to spread stories about themselves. So as we'll see in our next lecture, peoples such as the Hebrew peoples, who were for very good reason very scared of outside powers and being conquered, is the Hebrew people will start taking their stories of the past with them and documenting not just in Hebrew, but having them translated into Greek, what is known as the Septuagint. This was commissioned in the 3rd century BCE, was completed during the very beginning of the 1st century BCE, and there at the cut-out library in Alexandria is they had copies of the old stories of the Hebrews there in Greek, so others could come there and learn the traditions of the Hebrew people. More specifically, the stories that will be documented. If you ever have a chance to talk with a rabbi, they'll say, why are the stories so big and they're so grand? We have a flood, we have this, we have that, we have the angel of death coming through and punishing Pharaoh, we have Moses turning the Nile into blood. What does all of this mean? Is they are stories to scare other powers of the ancient world, to not have them come and to conquer the Hebrew people. We'll discuss that old storytelling tradition more in our next lecture. But during the Hellenistic era, scientific inquiry is going to spread around. Knowledge, culture. Everything is intermeshing, and it is going to be the Greek people ruling over these territories who will help to bring forward a notion of advancements, which will take a huge step back during the time of the Romans. So, what are the great outcomes that will come from the Hellenistic era that will be associated with the ideas and the legacies of Alexander the Great? While perhaps we can question some notions about how great Alexander was, we can also fully recognize that when he was done with his conquests, what was left over was really quite amazing and quite great. So do we base things off from his legacy of his larger life, or do we base things off from what actually occurred during his life? And we'll let you try and evaluate that in your reflection essay for this particular lecture. But we'll see is the Greeks will help to bring about a certain sense of unity of more and more what we'll call Western civilization. Alexander will help to bring an end to the eras of warfare between different Greek peoples. He will bring these people together in a united way, and these peoples will take great pride in dominating the ancient world and helping to advance elements of knowledge and learning. What it means to be Greek at this time is to be well-versed, well-learned, and be a person. The mathematicians and things that were studying there at Alexandria, they were also masters of literature, masters of music, masters of architecture. We're starting to build up concepts here we'll later call in European civilization the concept of the Renaissance. The rebirth when Europe looks back to its great past with the Greeks and the Romans and tries to advance these things forward with people we would call Renaissance men, people who are multidisciplinary. Along with this, what it meant to be part of the Hellenistic tradition was what I would call not cultural interactions of, hi, my culture, and here I have all my traditions, and your culture, here you have all your traditions. What we have here more is a diffusion where I have my traditions, you have your traditions, we've connected, and we're sharing ideas back and forth. And sometimes we're sharing gods back and forth, Romans stealing all the gods of the Greeks. Sometimes there are different stories about virgin births, about miracles. All of these different ideas, particularly some of the concepts of Zoroastrianism associated with the Persians, are spreading throughout the Middle East. They're spreading throughout the Mediterranean. The Greek language is facilitating people and talking ideas back and forth, and to adapt people's own religious and cultural trends, and to start trying to lay down the stories for people who have a distinct sense of who they are, to try to have holy texts that can verify and to be shared with others as to what these different traditions are all about. And the city of Alexandria is absolutely one of the most important things ever in bringing forward concepts of scientific progress. Alexandria was there to preserve the knowledge of the ancient world. It brought together some of the most important early historic archives in human history. It brought together people who were dedicated to the building and the advancing of human knowledge and the same traditions that had been brought forward by Socrates, by Plato, by Aristotle. And to take this knowledge, to expand upon it by observing others within this human realm, by observing the stars, trying to understand what our real connection was with the stars, not based upon stories of the gods and Mount Olympus, but based upon where stars actually are, where humans are here on Earth, and what our interaction is quantified with the natural world around us. The Greeks will fully bring forward the discipline now, not just of philosophy, but of science. And this is one of the great legacies from the period of Alexander the Great. Now, based upon that, in our next lecture, we are going to deconstruct some peoples who many of us learned something about as we're growing up if we grew up in any type of household influenced by the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Most of us feel if we participate in any type of youth activities one would call Sunday school, that we know quite a bit about the Hebrew people based upon our knowledge of what is called the Old Testament within the Holy Bible. What we'll do is we'll attempt to historicize elements of the Hebrew experience and to see where we can separate fact, fiction, myth, and to talk about the building and the advancement of a people who will declare themselves to be God's one chosen true people. That will be our next lecture. I hope you enjoyed this, and take care.